Now, I've mentioned earlier that the Tokugawa were also much better at controlling the countryside, and I want to go into more depth about that right now. Um, in the countryside, you were mostly dealing with a series of villages. There were different types of villages, as we've seen: farming villages, mountain villages, post road villages, fishing villages. But each village in the Edo period basically became a semi-autonomous political unit. What do I mean by that? Well, as I said earlier, the samurai were more or less withdrawn from the countryside into the castle towns and into Edo. Um, and this left villagers more free to manage their own affairs, which they really, really liked. Not everybody was happy to have samurai in their village. Basically, not all of them nice, fuzzy, warm people, and this freed the villagers from direct oversight and from periodic violence and extortion. So they were all for that. The villages were expected to have headmen. These were hereditary positions. There was one family who was designated the family of the headman. Then the eldest child, unless there was a good reason to make another child, male child, the headman, they basically oversaw relations between the village and the Tokugawa. They maintained the tax registers. They maintained the population registers. In conjunction with Buddhist temples, and we'll see that in a second. They read pronouncements from the Tokugawa to the village, and they were left alone as long as they fulfilled the obligations that were expected of the village by their lord. These obligations were oftentimes very severe. Figures, something like 50% of your crops going towards taxes. That was about right. And there were periodic forced loans from villages as well, and the harvest was by no means guaranteed. So very often there were especially the tax obligations, but also labor obligations, as we've seen, to go work on roads or other kinds of projects. These were often very significant for many villages and very onerous indeed. But it was the job of the headmen to make sure that all of these obligations were met, or else they would be punished. And very often the punishment was death. If for the headman, if the level of incompetence was judged to be great enough, and then people within the village who were also seen as especially making the headman's job difficult, they were also sometimes subject to punishment. Samurai could get involved in the localities if they wanted to. One of the most significant institutions in maintaining samurai control over villages was the institution of temple family registers. What these were basically a way for the Tokugawa to turn Buddhist temples into a kind of a unfunded arm of the government. Buddhist temples were supposed to keep registers of the families in the villages that were in the area of that temple, that were being served by that temple, and they had to record deaths and births, which also meant that in practice the government, through these Buddhist temples, had access to demographic information and personal information theoretically for absolutely everybody who was their subject, who was living in one of these villages. And cities had their own districts that were administered by temples, local temples as well. In fact, we'll talk about more cities later. But this was, let's say this, it was also a way to spread the cost of government out onto these Buddhist temples, but also a way to try and ensure a degree of social control that most pre-modern governments did not bother with. But now you have a lot of samurai who have second sons and third sons, and they send them to the temples. And you have village headmen who are able to read and help the temples administer this process. And you have more and more people who know how to read and write. And the Tokugawa regime, and the samurai, in their dealings, they don't have any wars to fight. They just serve as bureaucrats. So the amount of records we have from the Edo period are just astonishing. Historians are very thankful for this system of Buddhist family temples or temple registries, which were seen as onerous in the day, but which historians can now comb through to gain a great understanding of what was happening at the village level. These measures were also intended to help fight against Christian penetration of Japanese life, because everybody had to belong to a Buddhist temple. Christians technically would not be allowed to do that, or else they'd go to hell. So it was kind of a way to unmask them anyway. And so, just to get back to what I was talking about earlier, the obligations on these villages were sometimes very great. And it was in the interest of the headman and all of the villagers to work together to overcome crises. During the early Tokugawa period, this was certainly the case, when there were instances of, how to say this, when there was some kind of disturbance in the countryside because conditions had gotten too harsh, you usually found the headman and the villagers on the same side, trying to somehow reach an understanding with samurai authorities, to the effect of, well, yes, I know we said we'd pay 40% of our crops in taxes, but look, there were 2 floods this year. Can you cut us a break? And if it was in the interest of the samurai to cut them a break, then oftentimes there would be ways in which privately these kinds of negotiations could really reach results. Publicly, though, you were not supposed to show, as a peasant, any kind of disobedience to samurai rule. For example, even though it was very much the case that headmen did negotiate with samurai about important issues concerning their villages, that was, as I said, in private. You could not, for example, petition a samurai to have, to address this or that grievance. This was illegal. However, once again, what I love about the Tokugawa regime, or about the Edo period, is that you have these very clear laws, and yet it's also clear that petitions were a very common occurrence. As long as the villagers were clear that by engaging in petitions, or even sometimes more aggressively in protest, or even in rioting, that these public disobediences, these public breaches of omote, were risky procedures. If you tried to come to accommodation with your lord unofficially and he wouldn't listen, if you wanted to press the issue, especially if the crisis you were facing was that dire, if there was really going to be a famine, you always had the option of publicly disobeying him. You could, for example, petition him, which meant to have literally a petition, a piece of paper, scroll, or something that you sign, that you say, we absolutely need you to do this, and you could give that to him in public, and people would see you giving that to him in public. You may be able to get away with it a few times, but eventually, if you persisted in doing this, you would be punished. This is one of my the favorite anecdotes I have about this, is that technically, petitioning is illegal, and yet there is a great publishing industry around how to make an illegal petition. So you arrive in a town, or in Edo. Many peasants went to Edo because eventually that's where all of their lords ended up. Anyway, and you were supposed to, according to this book, when you went to Edo to basically jump in front of your lord's procession and present him with an illegal petition, the authorities would look more favorably on you if they think you just arrived from the road and were still dusty. So when petitioning, always wear bad-looking clothes and look really dirty. That was one thing. There were also books detailing all of the house crests of all of the officials, so that you'd know who to present your petitions to. There were people who would tell you the the routes of a lot of these officials in Edo, going from their mansion to the castle. And so there were ways in which even peasants could disobey if their concerns were dire enough. And oftentimes these petitions really did have the effect of getting samurai to change their relationship with the peasants, to somehow address some of the peasants' concerns. But you had to be prepared to pay a very heavy price. Leaders of protests and writers of petitions were very often punished, and the ringleaders were very often executed. For example, there is the story of Sakura Sogoro, who may or may not have actually existed. If he did, some people say he lived from about 1605 to 1653, but he may be just a legend. Apparently, he was a village headman of a village in Sakura province that was basically suffering hardship, and he petitioned his lord to have to provide some relief for the village, and while he saved the village, he and his sons were crucified, because the authorities felt that you had to make a show of force against these public breaches of omote. But gosh, if the peasants are willing to die, if the peasants know that they're going to be executed and they petition us anyway, then really what they're doing is out of necessity. And while we'll maintain our control by killing the ringleaders, we may also look into what they actually want us to do, and we may meet them halfway. So there were certain stages that you went to go through as a peasant if you wanted to do anything other than just to blindly obey. Informal contacts, and then you could choose to disobey publicly if you wanted to. So as I said earlier, in the earlier period, you had rich and poor peasants pulling together during times of crisis, and really facing the samurai, their samurai overlords, more or less as a united village unit. Interestingly enough, as the economy got more complex, as certain trends became apparent, to make a long story short, by the end of the Edo period, the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer, especially in the villages. As time went on, you actually saw a very interesting transformation where the poor and rich peasants, by the end of the Edo period, were fighting each other just as much as were the poor peasants rioting against samurai officials. You kind of saw the realignment of Japan more along lines of economic class than along lines of social status, as you have in, pre-modern societies like Tokugawa Japan, where you're born into a social class and you're defined basically by being a part of that status group, not by how much money you have. That's really a feature of more modern societies like, ours today. And we will also cover many of the ways in which cities interacted with this regime in a later lecture. What was happening in the cities is just so fascinating, I couldn't possibly cover it right now. Now, as I said earlier, the Bakufu started out with a series of assertive shoguns who were very, very careful to preserve their authority and to increase their authority whenever possible. But as time went on, basically in the middle of the 17th century, as the Tokugawa realized that they were now secure, that there wasn't that much danger of successful rebellion against their rule, they kind of calmed down a little bit and allowed some of the pressure to ease up from eased some of the pressure on the domains, and you had a situation where the overall trend was the growing assertiveness of the domains and the shrinking assertiveness of the Bakufu. This had several causes. Remember, the first daimyo, the first shogun was Tokugawa Ieyasu, this proven battlefield leader, this legend, and the second shogun was Hidetada, and during a lot of his reign until 1616, Ieyasu was actually still alive and kind of ruling in concert with his son. And then you had Iemitsu, the third shogun, who'd grown up knowing people like his father, who and also knowing a little bit his grandfather, but being very conscious of being descended from powerful, assertive military leaders who won the leadership of Japan through force of arms, and were now trying to maintain it through peaceful means, but who were really warriors. And all of these people were very active and were very careful to, all three of these shoguns were very careful to expand the power of the Bakufu, or at least to not really trust the great daimyo families any more than they could. The fourth shogun, Ietsuna, was somebody who had grown up in different circumstances. He was personally very far removed from the Warring States period, and so he was less assertive, and during his reign there was a perception that the power of the shogunate had started to erode. The fourth shogun, Tsunayoshi, interesting for very many reasons. He was apparently a great eccentric in his personal habits as well as in his policies. But the main aim of his reign was to increase the power of the shogunate, to gain back some of the initiative that Ietsuna had lost. But he found this already to be a task that was beyond him, and that's because the factions had emerged in the Tokugawa administration. The powerful Fudai samurai, right? The powerful Fudai, these powerful inner lords who dominated the staffing of the Tokugawa government, were coming into their own as power brokers, as people who controlled large portions of the Tokugawa administration, and the greatest of them dominated what was called the Council of Elders, the Roju. These roju basically just means like grand old man, basically a senior counselor. And this was a group of a handful of individuals from a series of well-connected Fudai families who, over time, began to form not exactly political parties, but cliques around certain powerful individuals. And these people, in many ways, were very beneficial to the running of the country. The Tokugawa administration was vast. It depended a lot on the personal connections of the various officials, and the shogun couldn't really oversee all of this. The shogun was somebody who had a lot of authority, and the shogun never became a puppet in the sense that the Ashikaga shoguns had. That never happened. But over time, basically, the government became more and more complex, and people became more and more established, and factions became more and more established, that a lot of the day-to-day business went through the hands of essentially people who had become career civil servants, the top of whom were these great inner lords who served as roju, and basically dominated the Tokugawa administration. Were not necessarily evil people, like Jafar, the evil advisor who manipulates the Sultan, but they were people who could get things done and who were in touch with officials in a way that the shogun never could be. And there were also other types of officials who could leverage their positions into political power. One of my favorites is a man named Tanuma Okitsugu, who was Grand Chamberlain, as well as Roju, but he based his power as much on the official channels of, being a Roju, being one of these senior elders, as he did on being the head of the shogun's household, Grand Chamberlain. That's basically what that is. Something like, the shogun's top personal assistant, because in his capacity as top personal assistant, Tanuma had access to the women of the shogun's household, women who themselves were powerful political figures who controlled a lot of the patronage within the castle, and whose support Tanuma used in order to influence the shogun informally. This man was very, very interesting. But in general, the bureaucracy became more and more professional, but also more and more relevant to the governing of the country, to the point that the shogun was not somebody who could just snap his fingers and everybody trembled at his word and hastened to do everything he said. And as I've mentioned a few times now, the domains really took this opportunity to recover some of their own lost political power. Certainly to do within their borders as much as they could, really. And so this was kind of a dynamic balance. Basically, what I mean by that is the Bakufu and the domains, the Bakufu and the daimyo who ruled the domains, both found it in their interest to cooperate to maintain this this government and this social order. That was easier and more profitable to them than to go to war against each other. And that was really, really new. That was certainly something that the Ashikaga and the Kamakura, the Ashikaga and the Hojo had not figured out before. Basically, it became easier and cheaper, and it caused less friction for the shogun to overlook minor disobediences, acceptable disobediences on the part of the daimyo as long as they happened out of public sight, and then to go in with fire and sword and to punish people for the least infraction. And it became easier for the daimyo to get along with the Tokugawa by playing nice and not to raise rebellion whenever they were thwarted and when people didn't think that they were rewarded enough, or something like echoes of the Wada rebellion during the Kamakura period. Not really very much of that during the Tokugawa period, although there were some instances of rebellion that were put down. Overall, though, the Bakufu did relax over time. Also, it's interesting to note that the daimyo did remain as something akin to rulers, so that while they were part of this whole overarching political structure that was administered by the Tokugawa, they were essentially kings in their own domains. And this was doubly interesting for some Fudai daimyo and for some Hatamoto, these inner lords and bannermen, who at the same time served in the Tokugawa central administration and were territorial lords of independent domains within that political structure. I mean, it just hurts the modern brain to think about what a conflict of interest that would be, but according to the system that Tokugawa set up, where the public performance of loyalty was what counted, you could have daimyo who were essentially taking these two positions with intense conflicts of interests and just putting those conflicts of interests aside and kind of agreeing not to talk about it. And within this system, there was enough flexibility, as I said, to account for long-term trends that transformed the Tokugawa government without breaking it, such as the long-term trend towards kind of the professionalization of administration in the hands of the senior counselors and the weakening of the position of the shogun himself. And also, as I've said before, this system did last until the 1850s, and we'll see that it took some very specific steps to have it collapse. This is all not to say that there were no rebellions, that there were no challenges. There were. The most serious was actually the Shimabara rebellion, which lasted from 1637 to 1638, which basically came about because some local samurai in Kyushu, some local daimyo in Kyushu, were greatly overstraining their peasants. They were just making all sorts of impossible demands on their peasants, and these peasants rebelled, and also into this mix came a lot of ronin, masterless samurai, who had either lost out to the Tokugawa or whose houses the Tokugawa had destroyed for all sorts of infractions in the process of establishing during the early years of the Bakufu. There were lots of masterless samurai. There were also some Christians who were very unhappy about being repressed so brutally. And this was one of the great triggers that caused the final stages of the maritime prohibitions. The Portuguese were seen to have aided this rebellion, so they were kicked out. And the Christians are portrayed as villains who basically fomented a very widespread rebellion involving hundreds of thousands of people and tens of thousands of deaths, if not more. Just 37,000 Christians alone are reported to have died. So everything, the Tokugawa blamed everything on the Christians, but really what happened was it was a complex set of events where all of the losers of this new regime came together, in part out of desperation, but also in part because there were just very disaffected people who were still around, and they were basically looking to pick a fight with the Tokugawa. Kind of a confluence of a local agrarian crisis and these larger political events. And this was brutally suppressed. The fighting was very bitter. The poorly equipped peasants and rebels managed to inflict some humiliating defeats and delays on the Tokugawa. The Tokugawa actually even called in the Dutch to help them. The Dutch were basically told, if you want to keep trading with us, you need to send out one of your ships and bombard the enemy castle from the bay, and the Dutch did so. It took over a year to suppress these rebels. It was a very bloody affair, but it ended in the Tokugawa's favor. There was really no chance that this rebellion would have caused an overthrow of the Tokugawa, but it was a very bloody and local crisis that the Tokugawa did nevertheless surmount with some skill. The other incident is, of course, the 47 Ronin, the so-called Ako incident of 1701, which features very heavily in your reading and your assignments this week. But just to give a brief overview, in 1701, the daimyo of Ako, Asano Naganori, basically angered a superior of his, a man named Kira Yoshinaka, a powerful Tokugawa official, who was in charge of, he was basically master of ceremonies in Edo at the Tokugawa court, and Asano would not bribe him, so Kira was not very nice to Asano during a reception of some envoys from the imperial court. Kira kept baiting Asano, kept basically poking fun of him, because he really did expect a very handsome bribe, and Asano was just not going to play that game. And Asano eventually got fed up with Kira's baiting and attempted to stab him, drew a blade, actually did stab him. Kira did not die, but the fact that Asano had drawn a blade inside of Edo Castle was a egregious violation of omote. He was doomed. He was, however, ordered to commit suicide instead of being killed. That was seen as a way to preserve his honor. Execution is seen as very dishonorable, whereas taking your own life through seppuku, that is dying your own death, that is honorable. But his clan was nevertheless dissolved, because Asano had very directly challenged the authority of the shogun by drawing a blade without permission in the shogun's house. So 47 of his retainers, actually 48 of his retainers, made plans to enact revenge. They lulled Kira into a false sense of security, and then a year later, 47 of those 48 went through with the plan, invaded Kira's compound, killed Kira, and then were ordered to commit suicide. They were also, in that sense, treated rather lightly, leniently. They were not executed. They were given the chance to preserve at least their honor and their legacy. And this was seen as a light, kind of like a touchstone for debate over the nature of honor, over the nature of obedience. Do you owe the greater obedience to the shogun or to the lord of your province? What should my reaction be as a samurai to their crime of these 47 Ronin, but also to the government response to this crime? There were many samurai who argued that these 47 should be pardoned and that they were actually heroes. So I hope that you get the impression that the Tokugawa period was a very complex period, where there were many people who were not happy with the arrangements, but that the arrangements were crafted well enough so that there were no great rebellions against the Tokugawa. The Shimabara rebellion was certainly very serious, but it was certainly contained and certainly put down. And then you had instances of disobedience, such as, for example, the 47 Ronin, but you never really got these intense, long-lasting, and very damaging uprisings by entire clans against the rule of the Tokugawa until very, very late, until the 1850s, when circumstances had changed so much that the system that Tokugawa had set up was no longer working anymore. But in its early days, it was a remarkable mechanism able to deliver, if not universal contentment, then at least peace.